Welcome back to part 2 of this tutorial series where I'm showing you how to use the Facebook Login API to authenticate users in your Node.js application running in the Google Cloud Platform. So let's continue right where we left off then. The first thing we need to do is navigate to the app.js file that implements the Node web server. So from here, the next thing we need to do is add the imports that we added as dependencies in the first video, if you remember from the Google Cloud Shell. So I sped this up just to save time, but what we're doing here is creating instances of each of the modules we imported that we need to implement our application. The important one to note here is the passport module, which is the module that we're going to use to connect to the Facebook API and do that piece of work for us based on our credentials which we specified in the config.js file in the first video. And then finally you'll notice the one at the bottom here, the config, is slightly different because I've specified an absolute path. Now Node is clever enough to detect imports based on your Node modules file based on the dependencies of our application, but actually with config I want to do something slightly different because it's not a Node module I'm importing, it's the config file that we wrote again in that first video, so I've specified the path to where it can find that config specifically. Okay, so now we need to do some configuration work for the passport library. So there's two helper functions that we need to implement. The first is serialize user, which has a function which takes a user and a callback function, and all we need to do is specify that we want to execute the callback function passing null as the first parameter and the user as our second parameter. The next thing we need to do is implement deserialize user. So that's exactly the same, but this time it doesn't take a user, it takes an object. And again, we just need to specify that we want to execute the callback function with null as the first parameter and object as the second whenever Passport tries to deserialize a user. Next, I'm going to configure Passport to use the credentials that we specified in the first video to connect to the Facebook API for user authentication. So we're going to say passport.use and then Facebook strategy, which is the library that we need an instance of here, and then we're going to pass three properties to that constructor. The first is the client ID, which again is from the config file. The second is the client secret, and the third is the callback URL. Now from here you can see the value in specifying these different parameters in an external file, because it means that if I make changes to the API, or actually I want to authenticate with a different Facebook developer account in the future, all I need to do is make changes to the config file and not actually edit any of the code here. The final thing we need to do is specify to Passport what we want it to do when a user attempts to authenticate. So there's a function which takes in a number of different parameters, but the one that we're really interested in again is the one on the end, the callback function. And I'm going to use this function in Node called nextTick. Now nextTick takes the current executing thread and moves it to a different call stack, which means that we can have two different processes going on at the same time on our web server. So the first one might be rendering some HTML, while the second process is handling the actual heavy lifting of connecting to Facebook and doing the user authentication. So to call that, I do process.nextTick and pass to it this callback function. So now we've done some initial configuration of Passport, what we need to do is configure our application, which is declared as an instance of Express on this app variable here, to use that configuration to be able to work with it so that users can log in through Facebook. So the first step is to specify some parameters. What I'm doing here is setting up some properties. The first property is views, so where should Express look for the views in our application, and we define that with the views directory. The next thing I'm doing is specifying what view engine I'm using, so there's a number of different ones available. I'm using EJS, so I've configured that. I'm also telling the application to use cookie parser and body parser, so that'll give me the ability to manipulate and read and write to cookies if I want to store user data so they don't have to log in every time they visit my page. And body parser is used to send the HTML content back as part of the response body. The last two steps are to tell my app that actually I want it to use Passport. So this will connect the application that serves the HTML content to users with Passport, which is going to connect to the Facebook Developer API to allow our users to log in. Okay, so now what we need to do is configure the web server itself. So I want to handle all requests in exactly the same way, so I'm going to specify app.get / and then specify here with this callback function what code I want to execute when somebody makes a web request to our website. So what I want to do is use the render function available in Node, and I'm going to render the index page, and I'm also going to pass this auth object. So I'm specifying an object here which is going to take the user from the body of the request object and pass that back as part of the response. Now this will let me customize the user experience, the front end of the application, based on which user is logged in. If you remember from the previous video, the index file, if you're logged in, will write your name to the web page. In order to do that, I need to pass the auth object back to the templating engine on the front end. That's the basic web server setup. There's just two more things we need to configure. Now those are the endpoints for the Facebook authentication itself. If you again think back to the first video, we specified that when somebody clicks on the Facebook login button, that it'll take them to a particular URL. Now this URL is /auth/Facebook. And what we want to have happen if somebody visits that URL is execute a function that comes as part of the Passport module, which is authenticate. And the parameter there, Facebook, just says what type of authentication I want to use. So Passport actually supports multiple different types of authentication. You could authenticate with Twitter if you wanted, or Google+, but for this example we're using Facebook, so that's why I specified Facebook there. The last thing we need to do is implement the endpoint that the Facebook API is going to try and call when somebody logs into our website. So that's /auth/Facebook/callback. And the function that we want to execute when somebody hits that URL is to execute the passport.authenticate function again. And I'm also going to do a bit more work than I did in the previous one. So if that request is successful, then I want to redirect users back to the top level domain, so the /. If it doesn't work, then I want to redirect them to, say, a login page. And although in this example I haven't implemented a login page, it wouldn't be much work to see how you would do that as a separate page. Should there be a problem with the Passport module, should that not execute successfully, I'm also going to implement this function. And all I want to do here is redirect people to the only web page I've implemented as sort of a try again. But if you wanted to handle errors in a particular way, you'd implement that here. The last thing I'm going to do is implement a logout page. Now, I haven't done anything with this on the front end, but if I had a button that went to /logout, it would execute this code. And all this is going to do is remove a user's credentials, so the user essentially logs out. So I'm going to call this res.logout function and then redirect them to the home page. So if they wanted to view our content again, they'd need to log in. Okay, and the very last line then, I'm going to call app.listen and then specify the port, just so if I was doing some local development, I'd be able to see changes on localhost. And that's it, that's the Node application built. So I'm going to switch back to the Google Cloud Console and run the command gcloud app deploy and accept the URL that I want to deploy to and hit enter. Great, okay, and that's all gone through now. When that completes, you can copy the URL there and paste that into a new browser tab, and you can see the web page. So if I hit login with Facebook, it should authenticate me with the web server, make the API request, and then show me that I'm logged in, which it does. So there you have it. You've successfully implemented login with Facebook on a Node.js application deployed to Google Cloud Platform. If you found this or any of my other videos useful, please hit like or leave a comment to let me know. And don't forget to subscribe to see new videos every week. Thanks very much for watching and speak to you again soon.